This morning, my question. Did you know Mississippi schools are re-segregated? Plus, it is hashtag FBJ time. My governor is really working my last nerve. And why a coat of pink paint is the ultimate sign of defiance. But first, this is the moment when the big change is possible. Good morning, I'm Melissa Harris Perry. Did everyone get the memo? Check your inbox. It was from the Hispanic Leadership Network, and the subject line was suggested do's and don'ts of immigration reform. You know, this one that the HLN sent to the GOP to give them a little bit of help when talking about immigrants. As they say, to provide tonally sensitive messaging points to those members of the grand old party who just haven't evolved discursively on immigration. Some of the do's and don'ts include don't use phrases like illegals or aliens. Never say anchor baby. Instead, why not use undocumented immigrant when referring to those who are here without, well, documentation? And when addressing border security, don't ever say send them all back or electric fence. How about saying the enforcement of our borders? The HLN, a group devoted to bringing more Latino voters into the GOP, advises Republicans to highlight that President Obama broke his promise on immigration reform in his first term. But they do caution not to focus on amnesty and to avoid at all cost President Reagan's immigration reform as an example that applies today. So it got me wondering when I heard Senator John McCain getting straight to the point this week.
How do you convince Republicans about the path to citizenship?
I'll give you a little straight talk. Look at the last election. Look at the last election. We are losing dramatically the Hispanic vote.
So, did Senator McCain get the same memo? I think he just may have gotten the other memo, the one that told all the congressional Republicans to get with the comprehensive immigration reform program. Because all the tongue twisting aside, language does matter. And in many ways, this is exactly the type of shift in immigration debate that many of us have been long calling for. One which channels our passions into respectful speech for the very real people who this political debate is about. Seems the Republicans got one more memo since the 2012 election, because there hasn't been simply a change in speech happening. Remember when this was considered respectable speech on immigration coming from Republican Senate leaders just 2 years ago?
One of the issues that is often talked about but never really seriously discussed is the practice of allowing people to come here illegally and have a child and the child automatically given American citizenship. I think we need to look at that in the future as to whether or not we want to change that, because I think it's an incentive to break the law in the future, and I don't want the third wave of illegal immigrants coming 20 years from now.
From illegals and anchor babies to Senator Lindsey Graham now being a member of the so-called Gang of Eight, in which the Senate, which has put forth its own comprehensive immigration reform proposal. So, heck, Graham says this is the time to get it done. A press release this week quotes him enthusiastically saying, "I do believe 2013 presents us the best chance to pass immigration reform." These days, everybody has a comprehensive immigration proposal to offer. I wonder if those bipartisan folks in the Senate and the House got the other memo, the one with these numbers, 27 and 2. As the Washington Post Wonk blog reminds us, 27 is the share of the Latino vote Mitt Romney picked up in 2012. And 2 is the percent increase in the non-white electorate projected for 2016. So if you see Latinos as a one-issue voting bloc, and if you want to take back the White House, then Republicans have come to see that the time is now. And like the many leaps forward from our past, no fight began just in the years preceding victory. The struggle for civil rights didn't begin in the 1950s. African Americans had been demanding representation since the 1880s. Women didn't just start fighting for the vote in the 1920s. That began at the founding of this country. It's a change in the political climate that creates the moment for that great leap forward. Immigrants to this country have been since
what could you do with the longest lasting 4G LTE smartphone?
And the recent pressure from dreamers and the economic dip that depressed undocumented immigration has trodden the political landscape.
Droid Razr Max HD by Motorola. Get up to 32 hours of battery life.
On Tuesday when unveiling his immigration reform proposal, The time has come. With me today, Aisha Moody Mills, advisor for LGBT policy and racial justice at American Progress, immigration attorney and former federal prosecutor Michael Wilds, Christina Jimenez, the managing director of the United We Dream Network, and media consultant John Rowley, who's a Democratic strategist, and in Tucson, Arizona, Democratic Congressman Raul Grijalva. Very nice to have you, Congressman.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the invite.
I'd like to start with you, Congressman, because I'm wondering, how did we suddenly end up here with what feels like consensus on an issue that just a few months ago was a wedge?
I think the momentum to reach this historic moment where the possibility and the opportunity to do immigration reform at a level and with the content that will be lasting and be good for this nation has taken, that momentum is building in communities and churches. I think the Dreamers crystallized that for all the nation politically, and much credit to this dialogue we're having now goes to those students and those young people. And then the election. Frankly, the beating the Republicans took in this last election in the Latino community and in the Asian community as well is the barometer of the future. They know it. And so whether it is by a heartfelt instinct that my Republican colleagues are coming to the issue of comprehensive immigration reform or expediency, political expediency, I really don't care.
Right.
This is a chance to do something that is right. And it's been a long time coming, much sacrifice, much frustration, much heartache in our communities. And immigration is not the only issue for Latinos, but it became the moral compass in this last election.
And Congressman, you make such a good point that I want to turn to you, Michael, on. And it's a point that the president has made about not allowing the perfect to be the enemy of the good, and that in the end, sort of perfect motivations may not matter. And yet, right? And yet I worry, Michael, as an immigration lawyer and a second generation one, in fact, you know what this looks like in the nuts and bolts of people's lives. When you look at the actual policy proposals, what do you think of what the president's proposing and what, for example, Marco Rubio is proposing?
First, thank you for having me. Such a pleasure to be here. He spoke so eloquently. This is a long time in the offing. With 5,000 ICE agents, about 270 immigration judges, not enough airplanes, handcuffs, and beds to detain and remove over 11 million people, we can't afford not to do this. And it might be political expediency that brings us to the table right now. And the Republicans could try to take credit for this. The Democrats can say this is in our DNA. But the bottom line is Lady Liberty has seen the rite of passage for African Americans, for women, God willing, for gays. The question is, what are we going to do for the millions of people that are here now? Are we going to let the dialogue deteriorate where we're going to say, no, we have to do border patrol first, and then we're going to deal with the 11 million second? No, we can't do that. First of all, we have more drones, more towers, more fences. By the way, newsflash, who's going to actually build that fence?
Right.
If it's not going to be, and the Republicans may not want to call them
undocumented immigrants.
They may not want to call them aliens, undocumented, but they're going to call them workers. And let's face it, from the hospitality corridor to the urban to the suburban corridors of our nation, we need help. We need all hands on deck. The entrepreneurial, the greatest risk takers in our nation's histories has always been immigrants.
Christina, I want to ask a little bit about it. It's interesting because there's sort of two ways in which you hear this framed. I mean, on the one hand, we heard the congressman saying, thank you to the Dreamers, thank you to the young people who managed to shift this discourse and dialogue. But what happens when the Dreamers become the face of immigration reform is that it no longer feels like it's the low-wage worker that is the face of immigration, when in fact those are sometimes the most vulnerable people. So how do we keep the complexity of immigration in the forefront as we make these policies?
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on your show. This is not only about Dreamers.
Yeah.
And I think that what it's helpful to keep in mind is that Dreamers, what we did successfully by coming out and sharing our stories and saying we are undocumented and unafraid, because that's what we learned in school. That's what we learned about the values of America, right? Freedom of speech, freedom of following our dreams. But Dreamers are part of families. And our parents were courageous enough to leave everything behind, seeking a better life, to come to this country. And that's what we're fighting for. And I think when it comes to sharing our stories, part of the work that we are doing as organizers, right, as the food soldiers, as you refer to organizers, is sharing the stories of our families, of our parents, because it is those stories that need to be reflective of the policy debate that we're having about immigration reform. And it's not only about the students.
Yeah.
It's about families. It's about people.
Well, and it's now, interestingly, about Republicans. Congressman and John, I want both of you all to listen to this carefully. This is a piece by Mr. Rush Limbaugh talking about Marco Rubio, and this idea that Limbaugh and Rubio are now on board for immigration reform, I think, is fascinating.
What you are doing is admirable and noteworthy. You are recognizing reality. You're trumpeting it. You're shouting it. Is that guy good or what, folks? Marco Rubio.
So, Congressman, here we've got Limbaugh, who is cheering on Marco Rubio for immigration reform. Am I in the twilight zone?
No, but I think you've probably seen the rawest and probably most offensive form of expediency you're going to see for a long time. But I really believe that key to that, and Mr. Rubio's proposals, when I tell people that, the senators came up with a skeleton, the flesh is what needs to be put together. And family unification has to be central to this. Yep. The issue of this roadmap for citizenship, what is it going to look like? Because if Rubio's proposal is to create a roadmap, limit the number of visas in order to unify families, it's a self-defeating proposition. The issue of security, I thought the president was right. Those cannot be tethered together. Yeah. They have to be separate. And before we talk about layering more money and more detentions and more, let's look at the efficiency, the use of all $18 billion a year on enforcement in the southern border. Yep. Let's look at that before there's a knee-jerk reaction to say, let's put security front and center again. That's all we've had for the last 10 years. And not do the humane side of this equation.
John, I want to bring you in on exactly this thing, because it feels to me like there are sort of two discourses. On the one hand, you've got FLN saying don't use language like illegals and anchor babies. On the other hand, you have the president and others still using border security as a fundamental part of this discourse.
Look, we should not have irrational exuberance on this issue. Yeah. When the health care debate began, the Republicans were saying a lot of good things and unifying things. This is going to be a tough battle. And when you think about what's happening in America, whether it's at the state level or at the federal level, when it comes to whether Republicans are going to work with anybody, look at what the Tea Party values. And that's what we're going to have. And you essentially think about what the angriest, the whitest, the oldest men in America, where they are, and they're not good on immigration. I mean, I've been in on some research recently where we were talking about Medicaid and government programs, and when you talk about how people view these things, a lot of what was coming out, especially from white voters and men, was that they're identifying immigrants as part of the problem. So I think I love the talk right now. I think we're going to have some serious crossfire once we get into the details.
Take it with a little grain of suspicion. Thank you to Congressman Grijalva in Tucson, Arizona. I appreciate you weighing in.